to understand the seventh seal, that the beginning also of the first trumpet. Unusual occurrence. Silence in heaven. And boy, the entirety of a half hour, quite amazing as we think about it. Verse 1 states that. We noted that it's probably indicative of something tremendous about to happen. Certainly we know that's the case. Something grave is about to take place. Very much an anticipatory silence. It's heavy with that anxious waiting for that which is coming next. We call it maybe for our common terms a moment of silence, commemorating something. In this case, it's a moment or 30 minutes of silence, a half hour in anticipation of something coming down the pike. And then that silence is broken. Verse 2, as kind of the spotlight looks on those seven angels with their seven trumpets. And my, what a great brass group that is, amen? And seven angels with seven trumpets. But before they kind of take stage front, if we might describe it as such, and we talked about the significance of trumpets and everything else, but in verses 3 and 4, we noticed that another angel, a different angel, comes on the scene. And he approaches that golden altar that we are told that's before the throne of God there in heaven. And there in his hand, he has that golden censer that we talked about. And it's much incense is given to him to burn. And as such, that burning and offering of that incense is combined with the prayers of all the saints, the Bible tells us in verse 4. And both of them in that sweet moment, that beautiful picture, they both ascend before the Lord. So as the incense is burning, the prayers of the saints and comes up before the Lord, it's a beautiful, sweet moment. And then something dramatic happens. You remember that? Verse number 5. Look there with me. Let's just read it again, kind of get back into the context. The angel took the censer. He filled it with fire off the altar. He cast it into the earth. And there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. And so everything changes, man. You talk about in contrast to the silence that was just in heaven. Here's this angel. He cast the fire from the altar into the earth. That statement about the voices, it's likely talking about the sounds of fear and horror from the inhabitants of earth as their ears are full of the sound and the shaking of thunder, and their eyes take in the sky dominated by that lightning storm. And then once again, another earthquake hits. We described this last time. It's as if heaven is reaching down and touching earth, right? It wasn't pretty, and it would continue, and it's only going to get worse. And so it's on this backdrop that the seven angels with their seven trumpets kind of come to the forefront. Now the picture is completely on them. Look at verse number 6. And the seven angels, which had the seven trumpets, prepared themselves to sound. The time has come for that first angel. He's given the go-ahead. He raises his trumpet to his lips. Look at verse 7, if you will. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth, and the third part of trees was burned up, and the green grass was burned up. So we call this, number one, the first trumpet judgment. It's the devastation on the earth. Bloody hail and fire destroy a third of the earth's vegetation. Okay, so as far as how it could happen, we said it's possible that a great earthquake will cause volcanic explosions, shoot large quantities of flaming lava into the atmosphere, and then the atmosphere being so troubled and so bothered, overwhelmed, that large thunderstorms would be triggered. These thunderstorms rain down large hail with the pieces of flaming lava. And so that's just one possibility of how what is described here could play out. And the devastation is great, right? To think an entire third part of all the trees upon the earth will be burned up. You add to that, not just a third of the grass, but all of the green grass will be burned up. Every field, every pasture, as we saw last time, every blade of grass will be burned. No green fields. Blackened land, charred and smoldering, will cover every continent. We also talked about the secondary effects of the catastrophic fires and destructive hail, the ecological upheaval that will take place in the aftermath. We finished up by saying, you know what? As we think about this, and really as we get into the next couple things, judgments, it really comes to play that this is a fitting and appropriate judgment for a world that has lived up to Romans chapter 1. They have taken the creation and they have worshiped it. They have held it in higher esteem. They have dismissed the Creator. They have dismissed the God of heaven in His power and His omniscience has created this. And they have embraced and worshiping the creature. And so this is an appropriate judgment. So as these trumpet judgments have begun, God's going to be both justified and glorified as the creator of all. Hey, can I just remind you, one of the things the tribulation kind of reestablishes, hey, world, this still is my Father's world. It still belongs to him. It's still his. He's still in control. He is still Lord and sovereign over it all. And really, very much a reminder. We talked about, as we finished up that judgment, and it does us well to remember going into the next few, that these first four judgments, at least three of them, in fact, an argument could be made for one we'll talk about tonight too, but at least three of the four mirror or are similar in nature to the plagues that fell upon Egypt in the Old Testament. Now, let me ask you, okay? Put yourselves in the shoes of the Israelites and the Jews, and more importantly, maybe even the Egyptians, when those 10 plagues failed upon them, when God sent them. What do you think might have been the most astonishing plague? The plague outside the death of the firstborn. What would be the plague that really, like, man, this is crazy. This is unbelievable. I would have never guessed this could ever happen. I mean, certainly all of them are to a degree. But what would be the one that maybe, shall we put it this way, it kind of rocked the world of the Egyptians. It kind of got their attention, astonishing. Well, I think it'd be a toss-up personally. I think the Egyptians would just be astonished at, first of all, darkness for 3 days, right? And the description of the darkness is what? It is utter, it's complete, it's the kind of darkness that you can feel, right? And so, I mean, that's just crazy, right? I don't know. That'd bring back childhood fears of being scared of the dark, amen? 3 days, the darkness. And then the other one, I'd have to say, man, right there, it's a toss-up, turning the river that they had deified into blood. The Nile River from which they gained all their sustenance, the river they worshipped as a god. I mean, life was sustained there in Egypt by the Nile River. And now it was turned to blood. Fish died and everything else. I mean, that's crazy. Well, what's interesting, those two plagues are here in Revelation 2. In fact, the second judgment, it begins with some astonishing events that disturbs and affects the oceans and the seas of the world. Look at verse 8. Let's just read the first part of verse 8 of chapter 8. It says this, "And the second angel sounded, and as it were, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea," or the oceans. We'll stop there for the moment, okay? All right, so we see this description. So number two, here's what it is, and we'll go ahead and get the description out of the way. Trumpet judgment number 2, the devastation of the oceans as a fiery mountain is cast into the seas. As a fiery mountain is cast into the sea. That's quite descriptive, and we really aren't given the time frames between these trumpets. We read them, and boy, verse after verse, much like the seals and so forth. So we don't really know the time frame between the sounding of the trumpets, but we can imagine. Could you imagine what kind of cleanup and recovery there would have been from the hail and the fire? How much time it would take to clean up things, the destruction of the trees, the grass, and burn up. That would take a long time. And I can just imagine that's going on, and then all of a sudden somebody says, "Hey, look there!" Or maybe they pick it up and on radars and things. Hey, this is entering our atmosphere. This is going to arrive in the next few hours, the next day or two. And they're still cleaning up from the first judgment. And the description is amazing, isn't it? We're told a mountain that is on fire is cast into the sea or the ocean. I really believe, as it often is written here in Revelation, we're given a perspective from the earth dwellers, an earth's perspective, the dwellers of earth. And so as they look up in the sky, it's as if a mountain that's on fire is hurling to the earth. Could you imagine what the television and social media coverage would look like? Again, we can just imagine, okay, the radars and the picking this up and noticing a disturbance outside the earth and realizing this is headed for us, okay? This is headed for us. Many of us have been around the different meteorite showers or whatever, Halley's Comet, okay? You remember Halley's Comet and so forth, and just all these things that, man, there's hype, and certainly now with the advances in technology, we're going to pick up on this as a world, as an earth, and you can imagine what that coverage is going to be like. So what is this fiery mountain? Okay, I mean, you just picture a mountain that you see. I think of the Great Smoky Mountains. Could you imagine one of those just picked up and in the sky, a volcanic mountain? Can I just tell you, if that's what God chooses to do, He can do it. He can remove a volcanic mountain from this earth, throw it into the sky so that it comes crashing down on the oceans. That is possible. God can do anything. But another possibility, and I think one that is logically probable here, is that this fiery mountain seemingly falling through the sky from heaven is probably a giant meteorite or asteroid like we've never seen. In other words, as the people of earth are looking up, like, what is that? In some parts of the earth, you can imagine it blocks out the sun even as they're in the angle where it's coming, and man, it's even blocking out the sun. Maybe, could you imagine what this would look like at night? The dark sky is lit up and by the flaming mountain. I mean, it's quite the description. And we can picture a meteorite, an asteroid, that as it comes into our atmosphere, because of the friction of it entering the atmosphere, it would cause the gases, if they're on a part of the meteorite, to go into flames. And it streaks through our atmosphere on a collision course with Earth. Now, imagine with me. Could you imagine the powerful and explosive impact a giant meteorite or asteroid striking the Earth would generate? Particularly striking the ocean? I mean, this would be a greater explosion than the atomic bomb. And as all the oceans are connected, boy, it would be devastating. The impact would spread across the earth. Certainly, the majority of the devastation would be in close proximity, hundreds of miles or thousands of miles to ground zero, the impact point. But it would still impact everything. And one of the ways that it would impact everything, could you imagine a mountain-sized meteorite hitting the ocean? Could you imagine the waves and the tsunamis that would be caused by that? I mean, it'd be hard to fathom such huge and large waves, and certainly we know of that taking place and so forth. I remember when the Carters were in Japan and getting hit by tsunami-like waves, and boy, devastation, and watching the videos of that, and Brother Dave and Steve and their families helped those people up there and things like that. I mean, you can imagine the devastation. This would be caused by this fiery mountain hitting the oceans. One of the fallouts of that is what verse 9 describes. Verse 9 says that a third of the ships of the sea and oceans will be destroyed. And we can conclude that the overwhelming cause of that destruction are the waves, the tsunami waves that would come from the impact created from that. A third. Now, certainly destruction in the human life is huge, but could you imagine the impact financially on the world? Why do I bring up the financial impact? Well, reality is this, that nowadays, and you see this quote from a source, nowadays about 80% of the world trade by volume and over 70% of the global business by value are provided by vessels, ships, and boats. Because of that, everything being shipped everywhere, and that might slow down because of tariffs, but anyway, we won't go there, okay? But things are being shipped all around the world, aren't they? And so because of that, in any 24-hour period, you realize that there is over 100,000 ships and vessels scattered throughout the oceans. This is an ongoing thing. This is a live update that you can go check on different vessels around the world and so forth. And you can imagine that of this 100,000, the vast majority are commercial vessels. They're oil tankers. They are cargo ships. They're fishing vessels. Some obviously would be cruise ships, some personal fishing and recreational vehicles. So think about that for a moment. This giant meteorite, this mountain that's on fire, it hits the ocean. Waves are created, and in moments later, and in minutes later, and hours later, and maybe even days, these waves take out ships all around the world, and specifically or particularly in that close proximity location. So before it's over, this judgment, it's claimed what? 33,000 ships. Could you imagine? Again, we're just basing a guesstimate upon what is on the ocean today. Could you imagine the devastation economically, the lives lost? What effect it would have upon the already strained economies of the world. Already we've lost a forest and wood and things as such, and the destruction of ocean vessels is, though, not the most astonishing part of this judgment. Look at the rest of verse 8. Notice what it says, the rest of verse 8. This is the crazy part, right? It says this, and the second angel sounded, as it were, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood. There it is, just like certainly as in Egypt in that picture there. I don't know how it exactly works. I'll be honest. I don't think anybody has a great explanation. They'll talk about maybe some of the atmospheric things, some of the burning aspect of that mountain causes it to have a red hue. I'm just telling you, the Bible says it turns into blood, and God already did it once. He can do it again. And He can do it to the degree that He wants to do it. And a third part of the oceans turns to blood after this asteroid falls into the ocean. And what kind of fallout does that event have? Look at verse number 9. Notice what verse number 9 says. And the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died. And the third part of the ships were destroyed, as we talked about a moment ago. So think about it. All 1/3 of all the living creatures in the oceans die. All living creatures. Okay? Fish or mammals that are in there, even I believe it includes plant life and such, all living creations, all living creatures. Several things come to mind. So think about that for a moment. 1/3 of all the animals, the fish, the creatures in the ocean are killed as the water turns to blood. Think about what comes to mind when you contemplate that fact. Number one, can you imagine the smell of all the dead fish? I mean, wouldn't that be gross? I don't like the smell of dead fish. I used to work in a meat department. We had a seafood section. Ugh. Stunk, man. I hated it. Could you imagine the smell that would come from that many dead, rotting fish? You say, well, how many is that? Well, the World Atlas, it would say, and it guesstimates, or quotes scientists as guesstimating or estimating, that there are approximately 3.5 trillion fish in the ocean. But that's constantly changing due to factors like predators and fishing and so forth. So could you imagine 1 trillion fish dead? Could you imagine the cleanup? Could you imagine the smell? Could you imagine how much sushi you'd have to eat right away? I mean, think about it. This is crazy. This is ludicrous. Those of us, I remember times when the freeze or something causes people to lose fish in their pond and so forth. I remember when Brother John Myers talked about his pond, and some fish were floating on the top because I believe it was the freeze or something and so forth. Or something affected them and they just all died. I remember that. And we look at that like, that's crazy, man. Could you imagine an ocean like that? 1/3 of the oceans filled with dead fish. Secondly, could you imagine the effect upon the fishing industry? Especially hitting hard the island nations which subsist by what they can catch. There are still nations around the world that their population, they live by what they can catch, what they take from the ocean. You can imagine the impact. And furthermore, we know that God created the oceans to be a blessing for mankind, the provision of food, among other things. Thirdly, the ocean that is 1/3 blood, turned into 1/3 blood, would not only affect fish, but the plant life and their benefit for mankind. You think, well, what's the benefit of the plant life of the ocean for mankind? It's greater than you might think. Do you realize that God designed the oceans to provide large amounts of oxygen for us? A lot of times we just think it's the grass and the forest and the rainforest and all the oxygen they produce. And like, okay, that's what we live on, the oxygen and so forth. But do you realize that the trees in the rainforest produce approximately 28% of the oxygen on Earth? That other 72%, well, that comes from the plant life in the ocean. A minuscule marine plant called the phytoplankton alone is responsible for 50% of Earth's oxygen. Can you imagine? And 1/3 of it's going to die. The days afterwards, mankind's starting to find it hard to even breathe, get enough oxygen. It's like you're up in a mountain as you change elevation, and it affects it because the whole oceans are affected by it. The rest of the source of the oxygen is algae and bacteria there in the oceans. The resulting disruption of this, of commerce and trade and even transportation, will cause greater economic woes for individual nations and the world as a whole. You see, this is the second judgment. The first one, devastation of the earth. We saw that, right? It's the devastation of the grass and the trees. Now we have the devastation of the ocean in great ways that will affect the entire world. But now we move on to the third judgment. Look at verse number 10. It's quite an interesting one. Look at verse 10. The third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp. And it fell upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. Now, again, an interesting statement here, that a falling star, not just any falling star, but one that is burning brightly. Here it is a second time. I mean, I alluded to it before. Do you realize how there will be people who say literally the sky is falling? Chicken Little will be finally believed. Amen? The sky's falling, man. You realize how many things have fallen out of the sky? Now we got this star that's burning like a lamp. It's flaming. The fear, the meteorologists. And let's put this in context, right? This follows up just having a mountainous-sized meteorite or something hit the earth, create all these waves and tsunamis, turning the water to blood. Fish are dead, and now they see a second one in the sky. I mean, think about it. Put it in context, right? This is crazy. You can imagine the meteorologists are all over this, and the prognosticators, and this is the end of the world, right? They realize that this celestial body then, oh man, can you imagine the fear when they realize it's not headed for an ocean, but it's headed for continents? It's headed for a continent or several continents. So you can imagine the fear when that is the case. It's a safe assumption, though, and we can just imagine all this buildup. People are hiding because they know it's coming. They're not 100% sure where it's going to hit on Earth. And as the TV report is going on, the live coverage of this falling star coming into the atmosphere of the Earth, and begins to be reported what we can assume that this star hits the world's atmosphere. It begins to burn up, and probably that's why we have that description of a burning lamp, right? And it breaks apart into millions of pieces. And these millions of pieces are deposited and spread, and it's fiery debris over a third part of the rivers and the fountains of water, as the Bible says here. It's a way of saying that it literally is over land that's streams and springs are within, wells and everything else, a third of all the fresh water on earth. So can I just tell you, in the moment, can you imagine what the world is doing? Don't miss it. It broke up. It's not going to hit the ocean or land like that other one. Yay. They're rejoicing, right? It's broken up into a million pieces. It's just scattered across the earth. That's a good thing. What harm could come of that? Well, this flaming star creates utter chaos by devastating the world's fresh water supply, polluting and contaminating them with deadly results. Look at verse 11. Notice what is described as the fallout. And the name of the star is called wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood. And many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. Let's call it this, trumpet judgment number 3. Now we have the devastation, apparently double, of rivers and wells, all right? So we have devastation of the rivers and the wells. This great star falls to earth. It makes all of them, or a third of them, bitter. So let's think about this. Fiery star hits the earth's atmosphere. It burns and it eventually just disintegrates into many different little pieces, debris, falls all over the earth. And people rejoice because there's no great impact. There's no huge situation like nothing turned to blood and fish didn't die and land animals didn't die from this thing. So that's good. And the excitement begins to fade after this. And as the excitement begins to fade, all of a sudden these different reports come in from all over the world. They begin to pick up on signs of the contamination of the world's fresh water supply. It first begins as people begin to complain about water from their faucets and other water sources tasting terribly bitter. Our water just all of a sudden became bitter. Oh man, taste this. This is terrible. And reports come flooding in. More reports come in from around the world and different places and different people complaining about their drinking water tasting bitter. And now it shows that it's not just limited to the United States. It's not just limited to Europe or South Africa, South America. There's people all around the world in different places complaining about this bitter taste. And then perhaps all of a sudden, the floodgates break loose, right? Because the reports become growing that people are getting sick. Sickness is spreading from drinking this water, and hospitals become overpacked with sick people. And just imagine, maybe over hours and over days, all of a sudden CNN is reporting this. And boy, every news station and channel is just blowing up because reports are coming in. And then all of a sudden, the unthinkable happens. The report comes in that someone has died from this drinking this water that's been contaminated. The world's nations scramble to get to the bottom of it. The inept World Health Organization tries to take the lead. And eventually they come to the conclusion that this flaming star of a few days ago that appeared in the sky, it has poisoned a third of the fresh water of the world. Now, isn't it interesting? The star is named for us in verse 11. So I think that maybe even somewhere someone names it and so forth, and it's named wormwood. As they discover that the debris from the star that rained down upon the earth, it fell upon the rivers and springs, it soaked into the soil and affected wells and everything else. It was toxic. There was deadly poisoning and deadly bitter. Maybe it's radioactive. We don't know exactly, but there's a toxin on it. It contaminates everything. It's an appropriate name because wormwood is the name for a plant in the Mediterranean world that is very bitter to eat and can be highly toxic. For many centuries, they even took the leaves of this, and again, kind of shows you how dumb some people can be, but they took the leaves of it. They made a highly alcoholic drink called absinthe. It's green in color, by the way. And they made this in different places. And literally, countries had to ban the making of this using wormwood because people were dying from it. This is how toxic that plant is, and so it's an appropriate name. Likewise, we know the term is used several times in Scriptures, isn't it? And it's always associated with bitterness and poison and death. The waters of Marah and other instances where we see that. Lamentations is a good one, right? Often it's connected with water. It's connected with toxic. Lamentations 3:15 says this: He hath filled me with bitterness. He hath made me drunken with wormwood. Some might say, well, how does this parallel to the Egyptian plagues? Well, again, I said 3 of 4. I wouldn't necessarily lean to this one being one of those. But you could make an argument that just as the water was made undrinkable, so it was with the Nile water. As it was turned to blood, it was made undrinkable. And so some point to that reality. And the fact is this. You know what we're not told? How long? How long did the bitterness stick around? How long was the third of the drinking water in the rivers? You couldn't even drink of it. And here's what I wonder too. Out of those fishermen, could you eat the fish that comes out of it? How deeply are the toxins? You know, I always find it's funny because, I don't know, I think it was Brother Earl and I were making a visit at the hospital. It was. We were visiting Miss Marilyn Balaban a week or two ago. We drove by the river cuts through Saginaw. Is that Saginaw River? Okay, good. Okay, it's a good name for it. Saginaw River. We drive by and we saw some people out there fishing. And a few weeks earlier, when I had gone to visit Earl in the hospital, I noticed out there were all the ice fishing shanties and everything else. I remember as we drove by, Earl looks at me and goes, "You don't want to eat the fish out of there." And you know what? You hear that a lot, don't you? Different places, right? That river, oh man, that's been contaminated. Somebody, some company, some industry has dumped something in there. You don't want to eat the fish out of there. I just wonder if all the rivers or a lot of the rivers are contaminated, if there'll be a warning out, don't eat the fish. Don't eat what comes out of there. And for how long? Think about the fallout, the sheer panic and fear. Can I drink it? Can I not? Where are the 2/3 of the earth where the water's okay to drink? And then the shortage of drinkable water in some areas would be overwhelming. And then this kind of turns a corner. Verse 11, we have mentioned for us the mention of the death of mankind. Look at verse 11 again. It says this, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. Now this is interesting, and this is a new occasion, a new occurrence within the trumpet judgments. Before, we had not had anything mentioned about human lives, though we can assume so that happened when the ships were destroyed and so forth. But here is the first mention of it, and it's mentioned that many people died, right, from the tainted water. So there will be great sorrow over the people lost. And this plague, it will overcome many. It is the first of the three, as we said, that specifically mentions human death. And I believe it does so because there will be many who die. It will be a true pandemic, a plague that affects the entire earth. And so as we think about these first three judgments, man kind of comes stumbling out of them, right? Because the earth's been affected, the trees and the grass, the ocean's been affected, and now the rivers and the drinkable water, the fresh water systems have been affected, and people have died now. And so you can imagine the shock and the fear of what will come next. And I'll just tell you, friend, we have turned a corner because as we get into the next few judgments, there's at least one that the fallout is all about death for humans. The greatest tragedy, we might put it. Because the worst for mankind is yet to come. Now, I mentioned it a moment ago, and I'll just tell you right now, as I look at this, you know what it's a great reminder of? Man, yes, Romans chapter 1 and verse 21, but can I just tell you, there's a God in heaven who is going to remind mankind, who is going to remind the devil, this world is not yours. You may be called the little g God of this world, but friend, it still belongs to him. It does not matter what Satan thinks he'll do. This is our Father's world. And he'll do with it what he deems necessary and right to draw men unto him and to remind them that he is the one and true God. Next time together, we'll get into the next judgments. Would you join me in standing? Brother Dave's going to come. We're going to close out our service by singing that song, This Is My Father's World. It's hymn number 39 if you'd like your